Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Today, we're going to be talking about habit-forming technologies. Can you hear me okay in the back? Give me a thumbs up there. Okay, terrific, terrific. So, if there's one thing that we've all seen over the past several years is that these tech products that we're all carrying around with us in our pockets these days can have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives, on our day-to-day behaviors. And so what I've done over the past several years is to look at patterns, is to study what is it about these products that come out of nowhere, and then in the span of a few short years, maybe 5 to 10 years, there's something that people can't put down. These products that start out as toys, as these nice-to-haves, and then somehow so profoundly change the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of users, and make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. I'm talking about the usual suspects of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Snapchat. Even in the enterprise space, I'm going to show you a lot of consumer examples today, but even in the enterprise space, companies like Slack or Stack Overflow or GitHub, how is it that these companies can so profoundly change users' day-to-day habits? So I wrote this book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and I'm going to share with you this basic model that I've found is endemic to all sorts of habit-forming technologies. Now, unfortunately, I only have a few minutes. I only have about 20 minutes, so I have to go pretty darn fast. Usually I teach a course at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and at the design school there. It's a multi-week course. The book is 250 pages long, but I think everybody's getting a copy of the book today, so there's a lot more information in the book as well. So I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of the model. So let's start with what is a habit. When we talk about habits, the definition of a habit is an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. It's about half of what you do, day in and day out, whether you like it or not, is purely done out of habit. These behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that we're on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good. And I'm not alone. Because today there is an explosion of companies using the psychology of behavior design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives. And that's, of course, what I want to help you do today. So here's the pattern. The pattern is called the hook. The hook is defined as an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And through successive cycles through these hooks, this is how customer preferences are changed, how user tastes are formed, and how these habits take hold. So I'm going to walk you very briefly through these 4 basic steps of a hook. Every hook starts with a trigger. A trigger tells us what to do next. It cues the habit. And for these triggers, we have 2 types. We have external triggers, and we have internal triggers, 2 flavors of triggers, if you will. External triggers you'll be very familiar with. These are things in our environment that tell us what to do next with some piece of information. A call to action like click here, buy now, play this. All of these things are examples of external triggers. Now, product people know all about these external triggers. You see these every day. You probably design some of these or have input on designing some of these external triggers. But what I find product people don't think about enough, and what turns out to be absolutely critical when it comes to forming these long-term habits, is creating an association with what's called an internal trigger. Internal triggers are things that prompt the next action. They tell the user what to do next, but the information for what to do is not stored in the trigger, but instead informed through an association or a memory in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain situation, a certain routine, a certain place, around particular people, and most frequently when we experience certain emotions, dictates what we do next. Dictates the solutions that we turn to, the technologies that we turn to with little or no conscious thought. Now, the most frequent internal triggers are these emotions at the top, but not just any emotions. In particular, they are negative emotions. So what we do when we're feeling lonesome or bored or dissatisfied or lost or fatigued, what we do when we experience these negative emotions, these pain points, prompts us to act, prompts us to look for a solution with little or no conscious thought. Now, some of the evidence that shows us that this is the case comes to us from a study that found that people suffering from depression check email more. Now, why might that be? Why would people suffering from depression check email more? Well, it turns out that what the study found was that people suffering from clinical depression experience what's called negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. And what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're checking their devices more frequently than the rest of the population. And of course, we all do this to some degree, don't we? What website or app do people check when they're feeling lonely? Facebook, of course. Where do we go when we're feeling unsure? Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what do? Where do we go? We Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't feel like working on just this second. Where do we go? Where do we go? We go to Twitter, we go to YouTube, we check stock prices, we check Reddit, we check news. We check all these sources for information to relieve us of this painful emotional state, this negative valence state of boredom. People don't like this sensation, and they look to be taken out of this negative valence state. So what's the lesson here? It's a bit of interesting pop psychology, but how do we build better products and services to improve people's lives, knowing about the importance of these internal triggers? Well, it comes down to fundamentally understanding your user's itch. That if you're building a product that needs to be habit-forming, that requires unprompted user engagement, well, then you've got to find your internal trigger. It's amazing how many clients, I go into my client meetings and I start talking to the team, and it's amazing how well they can articulate exactly the functional requirements of their product, but when I ask them about the psychological requirements, they haven't a clue. So it's absolutely critical that you identify these frequently occurring itches, these internal triggers that occur frequently enough to form a habit. Next part of the hook is the action phase. The action phase is the habit itself, and it's defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. Let me show you a few examples of a few habit-forming products, and I want you to notice just how simple these actions are. Something as simple as scrolling on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or what could be easier than hitting the play button on YouTube. These very small, discrete, simple actions done for an immediate reward, to scratch that itch. And it turns out that there's actually a formula to predict the likelihood of these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. Has anybody seen this before? Oh, good. Okay, so new to most of you. Very simple formula to explain all human behavior, but don't be deceived by its simplicity. It's a very powerful formula. Fogg tells us that for any human behavior any human behavior, online, offline, your behavior, your user's behavior, your spouse's behavior, your kid's behavior, all human behavior requires just 3 basic elements. Sufficient motivation, sufficient ability. Ability is how easy or difficult something is to do, and a trigger must be present. We just talked about triggers. Let's dive into motivation and ability. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, who you see here, the father of self-determination theory, Deci tells us that motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. Motivation is one of these fields of psychology that has been hotly debated over the past several decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur by increasing motivation, because all of us as human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of ad copy you've ever seen, every television commercial, fundamentally, these all utilize one or more of these 6 basic motivators. There's a lot more to be said about motivation, but for the sake of time, let's move on to ability. The A in B equals MAT, ability, the capacity to do a particular behavior. And here again, we have these 6 basic levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur by decreasing the amount of time something takes, the amount of money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. This is a big one when it comes to technology products, because the harder something is to understand, the less likely the user is to do the behavior. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past, which is why the best predictor of what you will do tomorrow is what you did yesterday. Why? Because the more we do a particular behavior, the easier it becomes and the more likely we are to do it in the future. What do we call that? It's called practice. So Fogg combines these three basic elements of motivation, ability, and triggers onto this graph, which is very useful in a new product development context. You can ask yourself, you've designed this beautiful new experience for your user, and darn it, they're not doing the intended behavior. Even though the app is wonderful, the website's great, why aren't they doing the intended behavior? Well, you can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation, low motivation. Does the user have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's way over here on the right. If something is difficult to do, it's over here on the left. And if the user has sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross that blue threshold, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur every single time. Online, offline, doesn't matter, any human behavior. Let's make this concrete just to make sure it sinks in. I want you to think of the last time that a phone rang in your life and you did not pick up the phone. Let me hear a reason why you didn't pick up the phone. Why didn't you pick it up? Didn't want to talk to the person. Maybe it's a telemarketer, unknown number. That's an example of low motivation. So even if you have plenty of ability, right, the phone's right there next to you, even if you heard it ring, you lacked motivation, you didn't cross the threshold, you didn't pick up the phone. What's another reason? That has to do with ability or triggers, why you may not pick up the phone. You're busy doing what? Maybe you're listening to this presentation right now. Maybe you're busy in the shower, right? So that's an example of even if you heard the phone ring, the trigger was present. Even if you really wanted to pick up that call, it'd be really awkward right now to get out of your seat and go to the side and be that one person who takes the phone call, right? There's social awkwardness there. It's difficult to do. So even if you have plenty of motivation, you lack ability. And you don't cross that threshold, the behavior does not occur. What's one more reason that has to do with a trigger why you may not pick up a call? So that would be ability. What's a factor? What's another trigger? You didn't hear it, right? Why? Maybe the phone's on silent. So think about this, right? You have plenty of motivation. The phone's right there next to you, plenty of ability, but you didn't hear the phone ring. I can't tell you how many times I get called into these big, expensive design reviews, and we sit down and we look at the user flow, and I ask the team, where's the trigger? What do you want the user to do here? Because for any human behavior, we always require sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and a trigger must be present. Okay. Normally, I would show you a few case studies here in the consumer web applications and as well as enterprise. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, you'll have to reference the book for that. But let's move on to the next step of the hook, the reward phase. The reward phase of the hook is where the user gets what they came for. It's where their itch is scratched a little bit. When we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by two Canadian researchers in the 1940s, Olds and Milner. And they discovered that when they implanted the brains of lab animals with a tiny electrode, and they allowed these lab rats to self-stimulate, they could push on a little lever to send an electrical current to this part of the brain, what they discovered was that the lab animals did so incessantly. They would forgo food and water. They would run across painful electrified grids just to continue to activate this part of the brain. In later experiments done on people, they observed similar results. That when people were given a little lever to press on, a little button to press on, and every time they pushed on this button, they would receive an electrical jolt to their nucleus accumbens, they did so hundreds of times. Some people had to have these machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop activating this part of the brain. Well, it turns out you don't need electrodes to stimulate your nucleus accumbens. Your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like luxury goods, sex, certain junk foods, chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, technology. All of these things activate the very same part of the brain. Now, originally, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believed that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to activate pleasure. Right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. It turns out that what we now know about the nucleus accumbens is that it doesn't activate pleasure per se, but instead it stimulates what we call the stress of desire, this wanting, this craving response. Because what we now know about the brain that Olds and Milner never did was that the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of a reward. But when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's finally going to make us happy and make us feel good, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So the way the brain gets us to act, the way it creates this itch, the way it gets us to do these behaviors is by creating this itch that we seek to scratch. That's the role of this part of the brain. And it turns out that there's a very interesting way to supercharge the stress of desire. Does anybody want to know how? Is anybody curious? I'm doing it to you right now. So when I took this long pause, you got the joke. When I took that long pause, I didn't say anything, and I asked you a question with a question mark at the end, some of you perked up. What's going on here? Why isn't he talking? What's going to happen next? And that bit of variability, that bit of uncertainty, the unknown, is captivating. And so we find this, what's called a variable reward, in all sorts of products that we find most engaging, most captivating, and most habit-forming. Of course, this comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember Skinner from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner took these pigeons, he put them in a little box, he gave them a lever to peck at, and every time they pecked at the disc, originally, they would get a reward. They would get a little food pellet. And so Skinner quickly learned that he could train these pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little bit different. He introduced a variable reward. So sometimes the pigeons would peck at the disc, nothing would come out, no reward. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased. It was observed to occur more frequently when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response, this wanting, this craving reflex. And so in all sorts of products that you find most engaging, most captivating, the things that hold on to your attention and won't let go, you will find one or more of these three variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me walk you through these briefly. Rewards of the tribe are all about social rewards. These are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. So the search for empathetic joy, feeling good because somebody else feels good, partnership, cooperation, competition, all examples of variable rewards of the tribe. Best example online is, of course, social media, right? When I open up my Facebook app every day and I scroll through my newsfeed, I'm never quite sure what I'm going to see. What photos did people post? What are the comments going to say? How many likes does something get? High degree of variability involved with social media. The next type of variable reward is rewards of the hunt. It's all about the search for resources. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other material possessions. And in modern society, we buy these things with money. So when many people think of variable rewards, they think of Las Vegas, they think of casinos, they think of slot machines, where the variable reward is what's going to come out of this game of chance, right? The uncertainty about what you might win. And we find the same exact psychology that we find in Las Vegas online. Let's take a look at the feed for a minute. Have you noticed how everything online today, particularly on mobile, has this feed mechanism? What is it about that feed? Well, let's take a look at Twitter's timeline. When I open up my Twitter timeline, maybe the first thing isn't very interesting, and the second thing isn't very interesting, but maybe the third or fourth is interesting. And what do I have to do to get more of that reward? What do I have to do? Just scroll. So that scrolling uses the same exact psychology of pulling on a slot machine, searching and searching and never done searching for that next variable reward. And finally, the search for rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are all about things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about the search for information or material rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. They're intrinsically pleasurable. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. So the best example I can think of online is gameplay, right? So when users are playing the Kardashian game or Dots or Angry Birds, when they're playing any of these games, they're not winning any material possessions. They're not necessarily playing with their friends, but what they're gaining is this pleasurable sensation of getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement as they play this game. Now, I know many of you, you're alpha types, you don't waste your time playing these games, and you're saying to yourself, yeah, but I'm not a gamer, that doesn't apply to me. I bet you play this game every day. Look familiar? Checking those unread messages, or finishing the to-dos on your to-do list, or the one that always gets me is that one notification on the front page of my phone that I just have to clear away, are all examples of this variable reward of the self, this search for mastery, completion, competency, and control. The point of the variable reward phase is to scratch the user's itch, is to give them what they came for, and yet have this bit of mystery around what they might find the next time they engage with the product. Now, just because variable rewards are so powerful doesn't mean that we necessarily need to insert them into the product. Many products actually use this principle of a variable reward by helping give users some more agency and control over something that's inherently variable. So for example, Google would not want to insert more variability because searching for your query, right, searching for what you're looking for is inherently variable. So they're giving the user greater control, greater agency over looking for what they're trying to find in their product. But it's still an inherently variable situation. Uber is the same situation, right? It used to be when you called your taxi a few years ago, no matter what how far away you were from that taxi, what would the taxi company always tell you? How long you would have to wait? What would they always tell you? 15 minutes. Doesn't matter if the car was 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour away, just wait 15 minutes on the corner, we'll be there. Well, now Uber comes along and through their interface gives you more agency and control over something that's inherently variable. How long it's going to take for my cab to arrive, by that little icon that shows you how far away the cab is. So it's either inserting variable reward to increase this engagement rate, or helping the user gain greater agency and control over something that's inherently variable. Which finally brings me to the last step of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is probably the most overlooked phase of the hook when it comes to companies trying to build habit-forming products, and it's where I think the most opportunity lies. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. That's what the action phase is for. The investment phase is something the user does in anticipation of a future benefit. The point of the investment phase is to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook, and it does so in two ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by loading the next trigger. Let me show you an example. When I send a message on WhatsApp or any number of other messaging services, you could insert Slack here if you like as well, or many other messaging companies. When I send someone a message, there's no immediate gratification, right? I don't get any points, I don't get any badges, nothing really happens when I send someone that message. But when I've taken the time to invest in that platform and sent someone a message, I've loaded the next trigger. It's something the user does to initiate an external trigger coming back in the form of a reply. And that reply comes coupled with this little notification, which is an example of an external trigger, which brings me back through the hook once again. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. And this is a big deal. One of the reasons I love working in technology products as opposed to things in the physical world is that physical products depreciate with wear and tear, right? The more we use these tables, these chairs, your laptops, your phones, the more we use these products, they depreciate with use. But habit-forming products should do the opposite. Habit-forming products should appreciate in value. They should get better the more they're used, and they do this because of this principle of stored value. So for example, the more content I accrue in my iTunes library, the better it becomes as my one and only music collection. The more data I give to a site like mint.com or Pinterest, for example, the more data I give these platforms, the more customized they become to my tastes and preferences. I can do more with these products, the more data I invest in them. The more followers I have, the better a platform like Twitter becomes as a way for me to reach my audience. So if tomorrow Twitter were to say, look, Twitter's no longer free, you're going to have to start paying us now, who's more likely to send Twitter a check? Is it going to be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they've stored all this value in the product in the form of their follower count. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because my reputation on sites like eBay or Airbnb or TaskRabbit dictates what I can charge for my goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms, even if a better competitor comes along, once I've stored all this value in the form of reputation? It's kind of hard to do. The products all of a sudden become very sticky. So that's it. The 4 basic steps of the hook: the trigger, action, reward, and investment, that through successive cycles through these hooks in your user experience, this is how customer preferences are changed, how tastes are formed, and how these habits take hold. That was a lot of information. I tried to squeeze a lot into a very little bit of time. There's a lot more information in my book and on my blog, nirandfar.com, but this is the most important slide of the presentation. Let me reiterate here that not every business needs a habit. Okay, there's plenty of companies that do just fine with sending users external triggers all day long. That's fine. You can send advertising, you can send messaging. That's terrific. But these companies that I'm describing today that require habit, that necessitate for their business models to survive, they must have hooks. Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp, these companies would go out of business if they didn't have habits built into their core. So if you require a habit, you require a hook. And so you've got to be able to answer these 5 fundamental questions. Number 1, what's the internal trigger? What's the thing that occurs throughout the user's day, the itch that you can satiate? Number 2, what's the external trigger that brings the user to the product? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? There's one more thing I'd like to discuss. I know what that nervous laughter is about. Many of you during my presentation were thinking to yourself, is this kosher? Is this okay to do to people, to use their hidden psychology to change their behaviors? Is that all right to do? And if that was your reaction, bravo. I think that is the appropriate, humane response to knowing about the power of designing for habits. Because let's face it, anytime we are changing user behavior to meet our ends in mind, that, my friends, is a form of manipulation. And we need to be very careful about how we apply these techniques because the products that we're building are the ones users take to bed with them every night. It's the first thing they reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So what responsibility do we have? As product designers, as executives, as investors, what responsibility do we have to use the power of habits for good? Well, I encourage you to work on something important, something meaningful, to use the power of habits to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives. And to borrow from the words of Gandhi, I encourage you to build the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. I think I have a couple seconds for questions, but when I take those questions, I've got a quick request for you. Can everybody please hold up their phones? Hold up your phones for me high. I've got 2 reasons for that. Number 1, hold them high, hold them high. Fantastic. Number 1, I'd love to take a picture of you. Fantastic. You're such a lovely crowd. And 2, I just increased your ability, right? I've made it easier because now the phone is in your hand to go to this URL, www.opinion2.us. Notice it's not .com, it's 2.us. There you will find a very short survey. Would love to hear what you thought of the presentation. I'm constantly tweaking it and revising it, trying to make it better. Please give me your input. It's only take you about 30 seconds. As soon as you click submit, you'll be taken to my SlideShare page. You'll have a link there to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. There's actually a lot more slides on my SlideShare page. Feel free to share those with your team, utilize any way you'd like. That's, of course, the reward. See, I practice what I preach here. So with that, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
One question.
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure.
Do people's response to a trigger change based on their understanding of the trigger? In other words, can manipulation be converted to persuasion with education?
So do people's responses to trigger, oops, can we leave that slide up, the URL, is that possible? Thank you. Do people's responses to triggers change? Absolutely, and they do for a few reasons. Let me start with one example from gaming. So many people, when I talk about variable rewards, they bring up this fact, look, well, why do games, games have variable rewards? Why are we all still playing Pac-Man or Super Mario Brothers or Farmville for that matter? What happened? Why are we still super engaged with these products? What happened? Sorry, Keith, to bring up Zynga for a minute here, if it's okay. But let's think about what happened with Zynga, right? With Zynga's Farmville. So Farmville at the time was the fastest growing game in history, amazing success story. And after the success of Farmville, what was the next game that Zynga released? Anybody remember? What was the next game? Keith, what was the next game after Farmville? I'll tell you. It was Cityville. And I think it was Cityville. And then after Cityville was Chefville. And after Chefville came Farmville 2. And then after Farmville 2 came the next Ville. And then the next Ville. And the next Ville. And users started figuring out that what was once variable became predictable. And so that's an example of an experience called finite variability, an experience that the more users engage with, the more predictable it becomes. Not bad, there's nothing wrong with that. It just requires a particular type of business model. It requires a studio model to always crank out new. Books, movies, television shows, all of these things require the next new thing. It's a studio model. As opposed to products that have infinite variability. Infinite variability is a product that the more we engage with it does not become more predictable. And so if you think about, compare LinkedIn. LinkedIn's constant strategy right now is to have the community generate more content, but there's also all this information flowing in from people you know. And there's a lot more variability happening on a platform like LinkedIn where you're seeing information about your friend's new job or their new vacation they're taking or photos of their kids. There's much greater variability about what you might find when you engage with a platform like LinkedIn. So that has to do with the variable reward component of keeping the experience, this bit of mystery around what they might find the next time they engage with the product. Okay. Thank you very much.